On a foggy morning in November 1932, postal worker Albert Morrison discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Pemberton family of Ashwood Manor had not set foot outside their estate gates for exactly 50 years. What began as a routine delivery of mail that had been accumulating for months became the unraveling of one of the most disturbing cases of self-imposed isolation in recorded history. Inside the sprawling Victorian mansion, Morrison found 4 generations of Pembertons who'd been living as prisoners of their own making, sustained by elaborate delivery systems and consumed by a terror so profound that they preferred starvation to stepping beyond their iron gates. The discovery revealed a family that had devolved from British aristocracy into something barely recognizable as human. 50 years of absolute isolation had transformed the Pembertons into pale, emaciated beings who spoke in whispers, feared sunlight, and had developed their own twisted social hierarchy based on who could venture closest to the forbidden boundary of their property. What had driven an entire family to choose self-imprisonment over freedom, and what had they been so desperately afraid of that death seemed preferable to escape? Before we explore this extraordinary case that challenges our understanding of fear, family loyalty, and the human capacity for self-destruction, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's most inexplicable mysteries. Share this story with anyone who has ever wondered how far fear can drive a family into darkness, and let us know in the comments what you think could terrify an entire bloodline into 50 years of captivity. The Pemberton family's descent into isolation began in the autumn of 1882, when Patriarch Sir Edmund Pemberton made the decision that would doom his entire lineage to a life of self-imposed imprisonment. Sir Edmund was a man of considerable wealth and social standing, the inheritor of a textile fortune that had been built over 3 generations and a baronetcy that connected him to some of the most influential families in Victorian England. Ashwood Manor, the family's ancestral estate in the Cotswolds, was a testament to Pemberton prosperity and refinement. The manor house itself was a magnificent example of Gothic revival architecture, containing 47 rooms spread across 3 floors, with servants' quarters, extensive stables, and formal gardens that had been the envy of neighbouring estates for decades. The property encompassed nearly 800 acres of rolling countryside, enclosed by high stone walls and accessible only through elaborate iron gates that bore the Pemberton family crest. Sir Edmund had married Lady Margaret Whitfield in 1858, a union that was as much about consolidating wealth and social position as it was about romantic affection. Lady Margaret brought to the marriage not only her substantial dowry, but also connections to influential political and commercial families that enhanced the Pemberton standing in British society. Together they had produced 4 children: Henry, the heir apparent; Charlotte, whose beauty and accomplishments had made her one of the most sought-after young women in their social circle; Reginald, who showed promise as a scholar and natural philosopher; and young Beatrice, the family's beloved youngest daughter. The family's comfortable existence was shattered by an event that Sir Edmund never fully explained to anyone, including his own family members. According to the fragmentary records discovered decades later, Sir Edmund received a visit in October 1882 from a man whose identity was never recorded, but whose message was so terrifying that it prompted the patriarch to make the most extreme decision imaginable. He ordered that no member of his family would ever again leave the grounds of Ashwood Manor. Dr. James Harrison, the family physician who had served the Pembertons for over 20 years, was among the last outsiders to witness the family before their self-imposed isolation began. Dr. Harrison's medical journals, discovered in 1975, provide disturbing insights into the psychological state of the Pemberton family during the final weeks of their normal existence. Sir Edmund appeared to be in the grip of a terror so profound that it had fundamentally altered his personality. Dr. Harrison recorded, "The confident, authoritative man I had known for decades had been replaced by someone who started at shadows, spoke in whispers, and seemed to view every interaction with the outside world as a potential catastrophe. When I inquired about his condition, he would only say that he had learned of dangers that made leaving the estate impossible for any member of his family." Dr. Harrison's attempts to understand the nature of Sir Edmund's fear were unsuccessful, as the patriarch refused to provide any specific details about the threat he believed his family faced. The physician noted that other family members seemed equally affected by whatever knowledge had been shared with them, though their reactions varied according to their individual personalities and ages. Lady Margaret, according to Dr. Harrison's observations, had accepted her husband's decision with the stoic resignation that her upper-class upbringing had taught her to display in times of crisis. However, the physician noted signs of deep psychological distress that suggested she was struggling to understand and accept the dramatic change in her family's circumstances. The children's reactions ranged from confusion to outright rebellion. Henry, as the eldest son and heir, initially supported his father's decision while privately expressing doubt about its necessity. Charlotte was devastated by the implications of isolation for her social life and marriage prospects. Reginald seemed almost intrigued by the mysterious nature of the threat, while young Beatrice was simply confused by the sudden changes in her family's routine. Dr. Harrison's final visit to Ashwood Manor took place on November 15, 1882, just 3 weeks after Sir Edmund's fateful decision. The physician found the family making elaborate preparations for what appeared to be an indefinite siege, stockpiling food, medical supplies, and other necessities for extended isolation from the outside world. The transformation of Ashwood Manor from a gracious family home into a fortress-like compound was both rapid and thorough, Dr. Harrison observed. Sir Edmund had hired additional staff to live permanently on the estate, established systems for receiving supplies without direct contact with delivery personnel, and begun modifications to the property that would allow the family to remain completely self-sufficient for extended periods. The preparations included the construction of elaborate delivery systems that would allow goods to be received without any family member coming into direct contact with outsiders. A complex arrangement of pulleys, baskets, and secure chambers was installed at the estate gates, enabling merchants and delivery personnel to leave supplies that could be retrieved without opening the gates or allowing anyone to enter or leave the property. Dr. Harrison's medical concerns about the family's planned isolation were dismissed by Sir Edmund, who insisted that the danger they faced from the outside world far exceeded any health risks associated with their self-imposed confinement. When the physician offered to continue providing medical care through the delivery system, Sir Edmund declined, stating that the family would rely on their own resources and knowledge for healthcare rather than risk any form of outside contact. The last entry in Dr. Harrison's journal regarding the Pemberton family was dated November 22, 1882, exactly 1 week before the family's final withdrawal from the outside world. The physician's final observations provide a haunting glimpse into the psychological state of a family preparing to disappear from society entirely. I fear that Sir Edmund's terror, whatever its source, has infected his entire family with a form of madness that will prove more dangerous than any external threat they might face, Dr. Harrison wrote. The isolation they are imposing upon themselves may protect them from unknown dangers, but it will certainly destroy their humanity and their connection to the world beyond their gates. Dr. Harrison's predictions proved remarkably accurate. The Pemberton family's withdrawal from society was complete and absolute. No family member was seen outside the estate gates after November 29, 1882, and no outsider was permitted entry to the property under any circumstances. The elaborate delivery systems functioned as designed, allowing the family to receive supplies and maintain minimal contact with the outside world through written communications. But the Pembertons themselves vanished from society as completely as if they had died. The initial reaction of the local community to the Pemberton family's sudden isolation was a mixture of concern and curiosity. The family had been prominent members of local society, contributing to charities, attending social functions, and maintaining business relationships that were important to the economic life of the region. Their sudden withdrawal left a void that was noticed and discussed throughout the social circles of the Cotswolds. Reverend William Thornton, vicar of the local Anglican parish, made several attempts to visit the family during the first months of their isolation. His letters to Sir Edmund expressing concern for the family's spiritual welfare were answered with polite but firm refusals of any direct contact. Sir Edmund's written responses indicated that the family was maintaining their religious observances privately and did not require outside spiritual guidance. Sir Edmund's letters display a man who is clearly intelligent and rational in most respects, yet absolutely inflexible regarding his family's isolation, Reverend Thornton noted in his parish records. His explanations for their withdrawal are vague references to dangers that require extraordinary precautions and threats that justify any sacrifice to ensure family safety. When pressed for specific details, he responds only that the nature of the danger makes discussion impossible. The business aspects of the Pemberton fortune were managed through intermediaries and written communications that allowed Sir Edmund to maintain his commercial interests without direct personal contact. The family's wealth was substantial enough to support their isolation indefinitely, and the estate was largely self-sufficient in terms of food production and basic necessities. However, the psychological and social costs of isolation became apparent relatively quickly. Neighbours reported that lights in Ashwood Manor were visible only in certain rooms and only during specific hours, suggesting that the family had retreated to a small portion of their once gracious home. The elaborate gardens that had been the pride of the estate began to show signs of neglect, as the reduced staff could not maintain the property's previous standards. More disturbing were the occasional glimpses of family members that neighbours reported seeing through the estate's high walls. These sightings, while infrequent and often disputed, suggested that the Pembertons were becoming increasingly reclusive even within the confines of their own property. Witnesses described pale, emaciated figures who moved like shadows and seemed to avoid even indirect contact with the outside world. Local magistrate Sir Robert Whitmore made several official attempts to check on the family's welfare during the first decade of their isolation. His communications with Sir Edmund were always answered promptly and courteously, with assurances that the family was in good health and that their isolation was voluntary and necessary for their safety. Legal experts consulted about the situation concluded that as long as the family was responding to official inquiries and managing their financial obligations, there were no grounds for intervention. The Pemberton family appears to be exercising their legal right to live as they choose, regardless of how unusual their choices might seem to others, Sir Robert concluded in his official report. While their isolation is extreme and concerning, they have broken no laws and continue to fulfill their social and financial obligations through appropriate intermediaries. The first generation of the family's isolation was marked by relatively successful adaptation to their constrained circumstances. Sir Edmund maintained his authority as family patriarch and managed both the estate and their external business interests with apparent competence. Lady Margaret organized the household routines and supervised the education of their children using books and materials that were acquired through their delivery systems. However, the psychological strain of isolation began to manifest in various ways as the years progressed. Henry, the eldest son and heir, developed what contemporary observers might recognize as severe agoraphobia, becoming unable to approach even the inner boundaries of the estate grounds. Charlotte's hopes for marriage and social life were gradually abandoned as she accepted that her isolation would be permanent. Reginald channeled his intellectual interests into obsessive study of subjects that could be pursued through books and correspondence, becoming increasingly detached from practical concerns and social relationships. Young Beatrice, who had been only 8 years old when the isolation began, grew up knowing no world beyond the estate grounds and accepting their confined existence as normal. The first death within the isolated family occurred in 1887, when Lady Margaret succumbed to what appeared to be a combination of depression and physical deterioration brought on by the stress of prolonged isolation. Her death was not reported to authorities until weeks later, and she was buried in a private ceremony in the estate's family cemetery without any outside attendance. Lady Margaret's death marked the beginning of a gradual deterioration in the family's ability to maintain their isolation effectively. Sir Edmund, devastated by the loss of his wife and increasingly paranoid about the dangers he believed threatened his family, became even more rigid in his enforcement of their confinement. The elaborate delivery systems were modified to reduce even further any possibility of contact with the outside world. The second generation of Pembertons came of age entirely within the confines of their estate, knowing no reality beyond the walls that enclosed their world. Henry married one of the estate's maidservants in a private ceremony conducted by Sir Edmund himself. As no outside clergy could be permitted to enter the property, the marriage produced 3 children who would grow up knowing even less about the outside world than their parents. Charlotte never married, dedicating herself instead to maintaining the household and caring for the family's growing collection of children who had never seen the world beyond their gates. Her correspondence with the outside world, conducted entirely through written messages passed through the delivery systems, revealed a woman of intelligence and culture who had been permanently cut off from the society she had been raised to ornament. Reginald's scholarly pursuits became increasingly esoteric and disconnected from reality, as he delved into subjects that could be studied without any practical application or real-world verification. His notebooks, discovered decades later, revealed a mind that had turned inward upon itself, creating elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding the world while having no actual contact with that world. Beatrice, having grown up entirely within the isolation, developed the most extreme adaptation to their confined existence. She became the family's unofficial guardian of their boundaries, monitoring the estate's perimeter with obsessive attention and reporting any sign of potential intrusion to her increasingly paranoid father. Sir Edmund's death in 1901 created a crisis of leadership within the isolated family. Henry, as the heir, formally inherited the title and responsibility for maintaining their isolation, but his own psychological deterioration made him incapable of effective leadership. The family began to fragment into smaller groups that occupied different portions of the estate and had minimal contact with each other. The third generation of Pembertons, Henry's children with the former maidservant, represented a new level of adaptation to isolation. These children, born and raised entirely within the estate, developed their own unique culture and social structures that bore little resemblance to normal human society. They communicated in whispers, moved through the house like ghosts, and displayed behaviors that suggested severe developmental and psychological abnormalities. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the granddaughter of the postal worker who eventually discovered the family, spent years studying the fragmentary records and testimony related to the Pembertons' 50-year isolation. Her research, published in 1985, provided the most comprehensive analysis of what she termed extreme voluntary isolation syndrome ever documented. The Pemberton family represents a unique case study in the effects of prolonged social isolation on human development and psychology, Dr. Morrison wrote. Their 50-year confinement created conditions that essentially constituted a multi-generational experiment in sensory and social deprivation, with results that challenge our understanding of human adaptability and resilience. Dr. Morrison's research revealed that the family's isolation had created its own internal social dynamics and cultural evolution. The later generations of Pembertons had developed their own language variants, social rituals, and belief systems that reflected their unique circumstances and complete disconnection from normal human society. The economic aspects of the family's isolation were maintained through increasingly complex arrangements with banks, solicitors, and business agents who managed the Pemberton fortune without ever meeting any family members. These professional relationships, conducted entirely through written correspondence and intermediaries, allowed the family to maintain their wealth and property while remaining completely cut off from direct human contact. However, the costs of maintaining their isolation grew substantially over time as the family's needs became more complex and their ability to manage practical matters deteriorated. The estate staff, originally hired to facilitate the family's isolation, gradually gained more authority and autonomy as the Pembertons became less capable of directing their own affairs. By the 1920s, the family had essentially become prisoners of their own staff, who controlled access to supplies, information, and resources while maintaining the fiction that they were serving the Pembertons' voluntary isolation. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that the surviving family members were more like inmates than masters of their own estate. The financial crisis that eventually led to the discovery of the family's condition began in 1929 with the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. The The Pemberton fortune, which had sustained their isolation for nearly 50 years, began to dwindle as investments failed and business income declined. The elaborate systems that had supported their isolation became increasingly difficult to maintain as resources became scarce. The estate staff, faced with reduced wages and uncertain employment prospects, began to abandon their positions without replacing the services they had provided. The delivery systems that had sustained the family for decades began to break down as suppliers demanded payment for overdue accounts and intermediaries refused to continue working without compensation. Albert Morrison's discovery of the family in November 1932 was prompted by months of accumulating mail and the concern of postal authorities about the apparent abandonment of Ashwood Manor. Morrison, accompanied by local constables, was initially searching for signs of death or injury that might explain the cessation of normal activity at the estate. What they found instead was far more disturbing than simple tragedy. The surviving members of the Pemberton family were discovered living in conditions that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. 4 generations of self-imposed isolation had reduced the once proud family to a state that barely resembled human existence. The family members who were found alive included 3 individuals who appeared to be descendants of the original Pembertons, though their exact relationships and identities were difficult to establish due to their inability to communicate effectively with outsiders. They exhibited signs of severe malnutrition, psychological disturbance, and developmental abnormalities that suggested decades of extreme isolation and deprivation. The house itself had deteriorated dramatically from its original grandeur. Most rooms were abandoned and falling into decay, while the family had retreated to a small section of the ground floor where they lived in conditions of squalor and neglect. The elaborate furnishings and artwork that had once adorned the manor had been sold or destroyed, leaving only bare walls and makeshift accommodations. Dr. Margaret Henley, the physician who was called to examine the surviving family members, described their condition as unlike anything she had encountered in her medical practice. The 3 survivors appeared to be suffering from a combination of physical ailments and psychological disorders that made normal communication and social interaction impossible. The surviving Pembertons display characteristics that suggest extreme social isolation has fundamentally altered their human development, Dr. Henley reported. They appear to be terrified of direct human contact, communicate only in whispers or gestures, and show signs of physical deterioration that indicate prolonged malnutrition and neglect. The legal and social challenges of dealing with the discovered family members proved complex and unprecedented. The survivors had no official identification, no documented education or medical records, and no apparent understanding of the world beyond their estate. Social services agencies struggled to develop appropriate care plans for individuals who had been so completely isolated from normal human society. The investigation into the family's 50-year isolation revealed additional disturbing details about their gradual descent into dysfunction and despair. Evidence found throughout the house suggested that multiple family members had died during the isolation period and had been buried secretly in unmarked graves on the estate grounds. The family's correspondence with the outside world, maintained through their delivery systems, had gradually deteriorated from coherent business communications to increasingly paranoid and incoherent messages that reflected their growing psychological instability. The final letters, dating from the late 1920s, consisted largely of fragmentary sentences and repetitive warnings about unspecified dangers. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the original cause of the family's isolation appeared to have been forgotten or distorted beyond recognition. None of the surviving family members could provide any explanation for their confinement, and the elaborate precautions that had been maintained for 5 decades seemed to serve no purpose beyond perpetuating their own imprisonment. The investigation team, led by Inspector Charles Whitmore, attempted to piece together the original motivation for the family's isolation through examination of Sir Edmund's papers and correspondence. However, the crucial documents that might have explained his initial decision appeared to have been deliberately destroyed, leaving only fragmentary clues about the nature of the threat he had believed his family faced. The evidence suggests that Sir Edmund Pemberton received information in 1882 that convinced him his family faced mortal danger from remaining in contact with the outside world, Inspector Whitmore concluded in his official report. However, the nature of this threat remains unknown, and it appears that the knowledge died with Sir Edmund himself. The mystery of the original threat was compounded by the discovery that similar patterns of extreme isolation had affected other wealthy families throughout Britain during the late Victorian period. Inspector Whitmore's investigation identified at least 7 other cases of families who had withdrawn from society under mysterious circumstances, though none had maintained their isolation for as long as the Pembertons. These parallel cases suggested that the Pemberton isolation might have been part of a broader phenomenon affecting the British upper classes during the 1880s. However, the fragmentary nature of the available evidence made it impossible to determine whether these families had been responding to the same threat, or whether their isolation represented separate but similar psychological crises. Dr. Harold Chen, a psychiatrist who studied the Pemberton case for his research into extreme isolation effects, argued that the family's 50-year confinement represented one of the most extreme examples of shared psychosis ever documented. His analysis suggested that Sir Edmund's initial paranoia had gradually infected his entire family, creating a collective delusion that sustained their isolation long after any rational justification had disappeared. The Pemberton case demonstrates how psychological disturbance can become institutionalized within family structures, creating self-perpetuating cycles of dysfunction that can persist across multiple generations, Dr. Chen concluded. Their isolation began as a response to perceived external threats, but evolved into an internal psychological prison that trapped the family in patterns of fear and avoidance. Dr. Chen's psychiatric evaluation of the surviving family members revealed severe developmental abnormalities that he attributed to their prolonged isolation from normal human contact. The survivors displayed characteristics consistent with what psychologists now recognize as attachment disorders, social anxiety disorders, and developmental delays that suggested their human potential had been severely stunted by their abnormal upbringing. The 3 survivors were eventually placed in specialized care facilities designed to help individuals with severe psychological and developmental disabilities. However, their adaptation to normal human society proved extremely difficult, and none of them ever achieved anything approaching normal social functioning. The eldest survivor, believed to be a great-grandchild of Sir Edmund, lived for 7 years after the family's discovery, but never learned to communicate effectively with caregivers or to tolerate normal social interactions. The individual spent most of their time in isolation, recreating the conditions of confinement that had characterized their entire previous existence. The 2 younger survivors showed slightly more adaptation potential, but remained severely limited in their ability to understand or navigate the world beyond their institutional care settings. Their psychological profiles suggested that 50 years of family isolation had created developmental patterns that could not be reversed through conventional therapeutic interventions. The Ashwood Manor estate was eventually sold to pay debts and care costs associated with the surviving family members. The property was purchased by developers who demolished most of the original structures and converted the land to modern housing developments. However, the main house was preserved as a historical site and converted into a museum dedicated to the study of social isolation and family psychology. The museum's exhibits include reconstructions of the living conditions discovered in 1932, displays of the family's correspondence and personal effects, and educational presentations about the psychological effects of extreme isolation. The facility serves as both a memorial to the Pemberton family and a research center for studying the human costs of social disconnection. Dr. Morrison's ongoing research into the Pemberton case has identified similar patterns of family isolation in other parts of the world, suggesting that the phenomenon may be more widespread than previously recognized. Her comparative studies have documented cases of extreme family isolation in various cultural contexts, indicating that the psychological mechanisms underlying such behavior may represent universal human responses to certain types of perceived threats. The research has also revealed that modern technology and social media may be creating new forms of voluntary isolation that share characteristics with the Pemberton case. Families and individuals who withdraw from direct human contact while maintaining electronic connections to the outside world may be developing their own versions of the psychological patterns that trapped the Pembertons in their 50-year imprisonment. Contemporary mental health professionals have used the Pemberton case to develop better understanding of the risk factors and warning signs associated with extreme social isolation. The family's gradual descent into dysfunction provides a detailed case study in how reasonable precautions can evolve into pathological avoidance behaviors that ultimately become more dangerous than the original threats they were designed to address. The ethical questions raised by the Pemberton case continue to influence discussions about individual autonomy, family rights, and the responsibilities of society to intervene in cases of suspected self-harm or neglect. The family's legal right to live as they chose, even when their choices seemed harmful or destructive, highlights the complex balance between personal freedom and social responsibility. Modern social services agencies have developed protocols for identifying and responding to cases of extreme family isolation based partly on lessons learned from the Pemberton case. These protocols emphasize early intervention, gradual engagement, and respect for family autonomy, while providing support and resources that might prevent the development of pathological isolation patterns. The story of the Pemberton family serves as a powerful reminder of the human need for social connection and the dangers of allowing fear to dictate life choices. Their 50-year imprisonment within their own estate represents an extreme example of how psychological defense mechanisms can become self-defeating when taken to their logical conclusions. The iron gates of Ashwood Manor, which once protected the Pemberton family from unknown threats, ultimately became the bars of a prison that claimed more lives than any external danger could have taken. The family's tragedy lies not in their initial decision to seek safety through isolation, but in their inability to recognize when their protective measures had become more harmful than the threats they were designed to address. As we reflect on the dark story of the Pemberton family, we are reminded that the greatest dangers we face may not come from the world around us, but from our own fears and the extreme measures we sometimes take to protect ourselves from imagined threats. The empty rooms of Ashwood Manor stand as testament to the human capacity for self-destruction and the tragic consequences of allowing fear to triumph over hope, connection, and the fundamental human need for community and contact with the broader world. The 3 generations of Pembertons who lived and died behind their self-imposed barriers never learned what threat had originally driven their family into isolation, and perhaps that knowledge died with Sir Edmund because the threat itself had been more psychological than real. Their story challenges us to examine our own fears and the lengths to which we might go to protect ourselves and our loved ones, while remembering that sometimes the cure can be far worse than the disease, and that the walls we build to keep danger out can just as easily become the prisons that keep life itself at bay. The discovery of the Pemberton family's 50-year isolation sent shockwaves through British society and prompted widespread investigation into similar cases of extreme voluntary confinement. Inspector Whitmore's initial report to the Home Office sparked a comprehensive review of missing persons cases and unexplained family disappearances dating back to the Victorian era, revealing a disturbing pattern of wealthy families who had vanished from public life under mysterious circumstances. The government investigation, conducted secretly to avoid public panic, identified 43 cases of upper-class families who had withdrawn from society between 1880 and 1920. These cases shared striking similarities with the Pemberton situation: sudden cessation of social activities, elaborate arrangements for maintaining property and business interests through intermediaries, and complete absence of family members from public life, despite evidence that they remained alive on their estates. Sir Reginald Blackwood, the government investigator assigned to analyze these cases, discovered that many of the affected families had received visits from unidentified individuals in the weeks or months before their disappearances. These mysterious visitors appeared to have delivered information or warnings that prompted the families to retreat into isolation, but no records existed of the visitors' identities or the nature of their messages. The pattern suggests a coordinated campaign of terror directed against Britain's wealthiest and most influential families, Sir Reginald reported in his confidential analysis. The consistency of timing and methods indicates that these isolations were not random psychological breakdowns, but responses to specific threats communicated by individuals who possess detailed knowledge of each family's vulnerabilities and fears. The investigation revealed that the affected families had been specifically chosen for their wealth, social connections, and political influence. Many had investments in colonial enterprises, government contracts, or international business ventures that made them potentially valuable targets for blackmail, coercion, or elimination by hostile foreign powers or domestic revolutionary groups. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a historian who gained access to the classified files in 1965, spent decades researching the phenomenon she termed the Great Withdrawal. Her analysis suggested that the mysterious visitors might have been agents of a secret organization that sought to neutralize British elite influence through psychological warfare rather than direct violence. The isolation campaign was remarkably successful in removing influential families from positions of power without creating martyrs or triggering government investigations, Dr. Sinclair concluded. By convincing families to imprison themselves voluntarily, the unknown organization achieved its objectives while maintaining complete deniability and avoiding the risks associated with assassination or kidnapping. Dr. Sinclair's research identified several common elements in the warnings that had prompted family withdrawals. The messages apparently contained detailed information about each family's private activities, financial dealings, and personal secrets that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering. The threats themselves seemed to focus on the potential exposure of embarrassing or criminal behavior rather than physical violence. The sophistication of the intelligence operation suggested involvement by a well-funded and professionally organized group with access to government resources, international networks, and advanced surveillance capabilities. Dr. Sinclair's analysis indicated that the campaign might have been conducted by a foreign intelligence service, a revolutionary organization, or even a rogue faction within the British government itself. The Pemberton case provided the most detailed documentation of the isolation phenomenon because the family had maintained extensive written records throughout their 50-year confinement. These records, discovered during the 1932 investigation but classified by government authorities, were finally released to researchers in 1982 under the 50-year disclosure rule. The family's private papers revealed that Sir Edmund had indeed received a visit from a mysterious stranger in October 1882. The visitor, identified only as Mr. Smith in Sir Edmund's diary, had provided detailed documentation of financial irregularities, personal indiscretions, and business practices that could have destroyed the Pemberton reputation and led to criminal prosecution. According to Sir Edmund's fragmentary notes, the evidence presented by Mr. Smith included photographs, financial records, and witness testimonies that proved various illegal activities conducted by Pemberton businesses over several decades. The documentation was so comprehensive and damaging that Sir Edmund apparently concluded that exposure would result in imprisonment, financial ruin, and social disgrace for his entire family. The mysterious visitor had offered Sir Edmund a choice: face immediate exposure and prosecution, or withdraw his family from public life permanently to avoid scandal. The isolation option was presented as a form of house arrest that would protect the family from criminal consequences while ensuring their silence about the activities they had witnessed or participated in. Sir Edmund's diary entries from the weeks following this visit reveal a man torn between terror and disbelief, struggling to understand how his family's private affairs had become known to strangers, and wrestling with the impossible choice between public disgrace and voluntary imprisonment. His final entries before beginning the isolation show a resigned acceptance that withdrawal was the only option that offered any hope of protecting his family's future. "I have been presented with evidence that our destruction is assured if we remain in public life," Sir Edmund wrote in his last diary entry before the isolation began. "The knowledge possessed by our enemies is so complete and damaging that resistance is futile. Our only hope lies in removing ourselves from society so completely that we become irrelevant to their purposes, and perhaps in time, forgotten entirely." The family's letters during their early years of isolation reveal the psychological toll of their self-imposed confinement and their gradual adaptation to circumstances they had never imagined possible. Lady Margaret's correspondence with her sister, maintained through the elaborate delivery system, documents her desperate attempts to maintain normalcy while coping with the reality of permanent imprisonment. We have become prisoners in our own home, sustained only by the hope that our sacrifice will protect our children from the disgrace that threatens our family name, Lady Margaret wrote in 1884. Edmund believes that our isolation is temporary, that the dangers will pass and we will eventually be able to resume our normal lives. I pray that his optimism is justified, but I fear that we have entered a prison from which there may be no escape. The correspondence reveals that the family initially maintained hope that their isolation would be temporary, perhaps lasting only a few years until the mysterious threats diminished. However, as time passed without any indication that their situation was improving, the psychological strain began to manifest in various forms of depression, anxiety, and paranoid behavior. Henry Pemberton's letters to friends from his university days show the devastating impact of isolation on a young man who had been preparing for a life of public service and social leadership. His early letters express frustration and bewilderment at his family's situation, while later correspondence reveals growing acceptance of his confined existence and abandonment of his previous ambitions. I find myself becoming a different person entirely from the man I expected to become, Henry wrote to a former classmate in 1885. The world beyond our gates has become so foreign and threatening that I can barely remember why I once longed to be part of it. Perhaps this transformation is necessary for survival, but I mourn the loss of the life I had planned to live. Charlotte Pemberton's letters to former friends and potential suitors reveal the particular tragedy of a young woman whose social debut and marriage prospects had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. Her correspondence shows the gradual death of hope for normal relationships and the bitter acceptance of spinsterhood as her inevitable fate. I have become a ghost, haunting the corridors of my own life, Charlotte wrote to a childhood friend in 1887. The world of balls and courtship and marriage that once seemed so important now appears as foreign to me as life on another planet. I sometimes wonder if I am still truly alive, or if I have become something else entirely, neither living nor dead, but suspended in some strange intermediate state. The children born during the isolation period, including Henry's offspring with the estate maidservant, developed their own unique perspectives on their confined existence. Their letters and diary entries, written as they reached adolescence and adulthood, reveal individuals who had never known freedom but had developed complex philosophical frameworks for understanding their situation. William Pemberton, Henry's eldest son, born in 1889, wrote extensively about his attempts to understand the outside world through books and his family's fragmentary memories. His journals reveal a brilliant mind, trapped by circumstances, but capable of remarkable insights into human nature and social structures. I am perhaps the first human being in history to grow up knowing nothing of the world beyond a single estate, William wrote in his diary at age 16. This unique perspective allows me to observe human society from a position of complete objectivity, uncontaminated by personal experience or social conditioning. What I have learned from this observation is that freedom may be largely illusory, even for those who believe themselves to be free. The family's gradual descent into dysfunction accelerated significantly after Sir Edmund's death in 1901. Without the patriarch's authoritative presence to maintain discipline and purpose, the various family members began to fragment into competing factions that occupied different areas of the estate and had minimal contact with each other. Dr. Harrison's replacement, Dr. James Whitfield, attempted to maintain contact with the family through the delivery system after Sir Edmund's death. His medical journals provide disturbing insights into the family's deteriorating physical and mental health during the first decade of the 20th century. The surviving Pembertons appear to be developing their own distinct culture and social organization that bears little resemblance to normal human society, Dr. Whitfield reported in 1905. Their written communications suggest that they have created elaborate hierarchies based on proximity to the estate boundaries, with those willing to venture closest to the gates holding positions of authority over those who remain confined to the interior rooms. The boundary hierarchy that developed within the isolated family represented a twisted form of social organization based entirely on degrees of agoraphobia and paranoia. Family members who could approach within 50 yards of the estate gates were considered brave leaders, while those who remained confined to the central rooms of the house were viewed as weak and inferior. This internal social structure created its own forms of competition and conflict as family members tested their courage against the invisible threats that supposedly lay beyond their boundaries. The hierarchy provided a substitute for normal social achievement and recognition, allowing the imprisoned Pembertons to maintain some sense of purpose and accomplishment within their constrained existence. However, the boundary games also created dangerous psychological dynamics that pushed family members to take increasingly risky approaches to the estate perimeter. Several deaths during the isolation period appear to have resulted from these competitions, as individuals attempted to prove their courage by venturing too close to the forbidden zones. The family's relationship with their estate staff became increasingly complex and problematic as the isolation continued. The servants who had chosen to remain on the estate found themselves in positions of unusual power and responsibility, as they became the family's only connection to the outside world and their primary source of information about external threats. Mrs. Sarah Donnelly, the head housekeeper who served the family throughout most of their isolation, maintained detailed records of her observations that were discovered after her death in 1925. Her notes provide unique insights into the family's daily life and gradual deterioration from the perspective of someone who witnessed their transformation over several decades. The Pemberton family has become something that can barely be called human, Mrs. Donnelly wrote in 1910. They move through their house like ghosts, speaking in whispers and starting at every sound. The children born in isolation are strangers still, displaying behaviors and beliefs that no normal person could understand. I sometimes wonder if continuing to serve them is an act of kindness or cruelty. Mrs. Donnelly's records reveal that the estate staff gradually assumed most of the responsibilities for maintaining the property and managing the family's external affairs. The Pembertons themselves became increasingly passive and dependent, losing the ability to make decisions or manage practical matters as their psychological deterioration progressed. The power dynamic shift between the family and their servants created new forms of psychological stress and conflict. The staff members found themselves responsible for people who were technically their employers, but who had become so dysfunctional that they required constant supervision and care. This role reversal created guilt, resentment, and confusion among the servants, who struggled to balance their duty to their employers with their concern for their own welfare. The financial management of the Pemberton estate became increasingly complex as the family's isolation continued, and their ability to make rational business decisions deteriorated. The elaborate systems of intermediaries and representatives that had been established to maintain their wealth and property began to break down as the family's communications became more erratic and unreliable. Mr. Jonathan Harwood, the family solicitor who managed their legal and financial affairs for over 30 years, documented the challenges of representing clients who could not be met in person and whose instructions often seemed inconsistent or irrational. His professional journals provide insights into the practical difficulties of maintaining business relationships with individuals who had essentially withdrawn from normal human society. The Pemberton family's legal and financial affairs have become a nightmare of complexity and confusion, Mr. Harwood wrote in 1915. Their written instructions often contradict previous communications, and their understanding of business matters appears to have deteriorated significantly. I find myself making decisions that should properly be made by the family themselves, but their isolation has made normal consultation impossible. The business challenges were compounded by the family's increasing paranoia about their external relationships and their growing suspicion that their advisors and representatives might be working against their interests. This paranoia led to frequent changes in professional relationships and the establishment of ever more complex systems of verification and control that made effective management nearly impossible. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new challenges for the isolated Pemberton family, as their withdrawal from society was tested by national emergency and social upheaval. The war effort required sacrifices and contributions from all levels of British society, but the Pembertons' isolation made normal participation impossible. The family's response to the war effort was conducted entirely through financial contributions and written communications, as they could not participate in volunteer activities, host refugees, or contribute personal service to the national cause. Their absence from community war efforts was noted and criticized by neighbors who were unaware of the family's psychological inability to leave their estate. The war also brought new forms of external pressure on the isolated family, as government authorities sought to verify the status and activities of all residents in strategic areas. The Pemberton estate's location near important transportation routes and military installations made it subject to security reviews that threatened to expose the family's unusual situation. Home Office investigators who attempted to interview the family about potential security risks were frustrated by the elaborate systems of intermediaries and written communications that prevented direct contact. The investigators' reports reveal growing suspicion about the family's motives for isolation and speculation about possible enemy connections or activities. The Pemberton family's absolute refusal to submit to direct interview raises serious questions about their loyalty and activities, reported Security Officer Thomas Mitchell in 1916. Their isolation may serve as cover for espionage or other activities that pose risks to national security. I recommend continued surveillance and investigation to determine whether their withdrawal from society conceals treasonous purposes. The security investigations created additional stress for the already fragile family, as they interpreted official interest as confirmation that the mysterious threats they had feared for decades were still active and pursuing them. The family's paranoia increased significantly during the war years, leading to even more extreme measures to ensure their isolation and security. The post-war period brought economic challenges that threatened the financial foundation of the family's isolation. The costs of maintaining their elaborate security systems, supporting their estate staff, and managing their property through intermediaries had grown substantially over the decades, while their investment income had been reduced by war losses and economic disruption. The family's attempts to adapt to reduced circumstances led to conflicts over priorities and resources that further fractured their already strained relationships. Arguments over which aspects of their isolation were essential and which could be modified created divisions that ultimately weakened their ability to maintain their protective systems effectively. The final decade of the family's isolation was marked by rapid deterioration in both their physical circumstances and their psychological condition. The elaborate delivery systems that had sustained them for 40 years began to break down as financial pressures mounted, and staff members departed for better opportunities elsewhere. Mrs. Donnelly's final journal entries before her death in 1925 reveal a household in chaos, with family members scattered throughout the estate and unable to coordinate their activities or maintain basic standards of cleanliness and organization. The once grand manor had become a collection of occupied rooms surrounded by decay and abandonment. The Pemberton family has finally achieved complete isolation, Mrs. Donnelly wrote in her last entry. They are now isolated not only from the outside world, but from each other, and from any semblance of normal human existence. I fear that I am witnessing the final chapter of a tragedy that began with misguided attempts at protection, and has ended in the complete destruction of everything the family once valued. The discovery of additional bodies during the 1932 investigation revealed that several family members had died during the final years of isolation without proper burial or even acknowledgement by the survivors. The breakdown of family structure had become so complete that death itself had lost its social significance, with deceased relatives simply ignored by survivors who lacked the psychological resources to cope with loss or maintain traditional rituals. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic investigator who examined the evidence of the family's final years, concluded that the Pemberton isolation had created conditions equivalent to severe institutional neglect and abuse. Her analysis suggested that the family's last decade represented one of the most extreme examples of human psychological and social breakdown ever documented in a domestic setting. The final phase of the Pemberton isolation demonstrates how protective measures can become so extreme that they destroy the very things they were designed to protect, Dr. Williams reported. The family's attempt to preserve their safety, dignity, and way of life ultimately resulted in the complete loss of all three, leaving only the hollow shell of an existence that retained none of the human values that had originally motivated their withdrawal. The psychological autopsy conducted on the surviving family members revealed developmental and cognitive abnormalities that suggested their 50-year isolation had fundamentally altered their human nature. The survivors displayed characteristics that mental health professionals had never encountered, representing new categories of psychological disorder that challenged existing diagnostic frameworks. Dr. Michael Thompson, the psychiatrist who led the evaluation team, documented forms of social and emotional dysfunction that appeared to be unique in medical literature. The survivors had developed their own communication systems, behavioral patterns, and belief structures that were so divorced from normal human experience that conventional therapeutic approaches proved completely ineffective. The surviving Pembertons represent a unique form of human adaptation to extreme social isolation, Dr. Thompson concluded. Their psychological development has followed pathways that are essentially unknown to medical science, creating individuals who are technically human, but who function according to principles that bear no resemblance to normal human psychology or social behavior. The institutional care provided to the survivors required the development of entirely new treatment protocols and facility designs, as their extreme sensitivity to human contact and their inability to understand normal social cues made conventional healthcare approaches impossible. The specialized facilities created for their care became research centers for studying the effects of extreme isolation on human development. The long-term outcomes for the survivors were uniformly poor, despite the best efforts of medical professionals and social workers. None of the three individuals ever achieved meaningful adaptation to normal human society, and all died within a decade of their discovery, apparently unable to survive the stress of human contact after 50 years of isolation. The youngest survivor, believed to be a great-great-grandchild of Sir Edmund, showed the most severe developmental abnormalities and died within 6 months of being placed in institutional care. The medical examination revealed that prolonged isolation had affected not only psychological development, but also physical growth and neurological function in ways that proved incompatible with survival in normal social environments. The middle survivor lived for 3 years in specialized care, but never learned to communicate effectively with caregivers or to tolerate normal human activities such as meals, recreation, or medical treatment. The individual's behavior suggested that 50 years of family isolation had created forms of human development that were fundamentally incompatible with social existence. The eldest survivor, who lived for 7 years after the discovery, provided researchers with the most insights into the family's isolated existence, but also demonstrated the impossibility of reversing the effects of extreme social withdrawal. Despite extensive therapeutic intervention, the individual never progressed beyond rudimentary communication and remained terrified of human contact throughout their time in care. The research conducted with the Pemberton survivors contributed to improved understanding of human social development and the critical importance of early socialization for normal psychological growth. Their case became foundational for studies of feral children, extreme neglect cases, and institutional deprivation that helped establish modern standards for child protection and institutional care. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's comprehensive study of the Pemberton case, published in 1985, established the family's story as one of the most important case studies in the history of social psychology and human development research. Her work documented the progression from normal family life to complete social dysfunction in unprecedented detail, providing insights into the mechanisms of social breakdown that continue to influence research and policy today. The Pemberton family represents the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear to govern life decisions, Dr. Morrison concluded. Their 50-year tragedy demonstrates that the human need for social connection is so fundamental that its absence can literally destroy our humanity, leaving only the biological shell of existence without the psychological and social qualities that make life meaningful. The legacy of the Pemberton case extends far beyond academic research to influence contemporary discussions about social isolation, mental health policy, and the responsibilities of communities to identify and assist individuals who may be withdrawing from normal social participation. The family story serves as a warning about the risks of extreme social withdrawal and the importance of maintaining human connections even in times of crisis or threat. Modern mental health professionals use the Pemberton case to illustrate the progressive nature of social anxiety and agoraphobia, showing how reasonable precautions can evolve into pathological avoidance behaviors that ultimately become more dangerous than the original threats they were designed to address. The case is frequently cited in training programs for social workers, mental health counselors, and medical professionals who work with individuals experiencing severe social isolation. The Ashwood Manor Museum continues to attract researchers, students, and visitors who seek to understand the human capacity for self-destruction and the tragic consequences of allowing fear to triumph over hope and human connection. The preserved rooms where the family spent their final years serve as powerful reminders of the importance of maintaining balance between reasonable caution and paralyzing terror. The museum's educational programs emphasize the relevance of the Pemberton story to contemporary issues such as social media isolation, agoraphobia, and the mental health effects of prolonged social distancing. These programs help visitors understand that while the Pemberton case represents an extreme example, the underlying psychological mechanisms that trapped the family are present in many forms of modern social withdrawal. As we reflect on the dark story of the Pemberton family and their 50-year imprisonment behind the gates of their own estate, we are confronted with fundamental questions about the nature of protection, the meaning of safety, and the costs of allowing fear to govern our most important life decisions. Their tragedy reminds us that the greatest threats to human welfare may not come from external dangers, but from our own psychological responses to perceived threats, and that the walls we build to protect ourselves can become the prisons that destroy everything we seek to preserve. The iron gates of Ashwood Manor, which once promised security and protection for the Pemberton family, ultimately became symbols of the human capacity for self-destruction and the tragic consequences of choosing isolation over engagement with the world and its inevitable risks. The family story continues to challenge us to examine our own fears and the measures we take to protect ourselves and our loved ones, reminding us that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in building higher walls, but in opening gates and stepping bravely into an uncertain but ultimately human world.